Hello, and welcome to the Permission to Breathe podcast, a transformative space dedicated to providing a sanctuary where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely, embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. Tammy Isaac, here with you every Monday to offer comfort, guidance, and hope. Together we'll navigate this path, finding moments to pause, reflect, and breathe. Let's begin this journey side by side. Today's episode is sponsored by Let the Church Grieve by Dr. Tammy Isaac, a compelling book that explores the often overlooked subject of grief within spiritual communities. Dr. Isaac combines personal antidotes with theological insights, providing a compassionate framework for understanding and addressing grief collectively. This book emphasizes the need for spiritual leaders to create safe spaces for mourning and guides congregations through the grieving process with faith and empathy. It's a must-read for anyone looking to support those experiencing grief within their spiritual communities. Grab your copy of Let the Church Grieve at www.drtammyisaac.com today and begin the journey towards healing and growth. Welcome back to the Permission to Breathe podcast, where we make space for our stories, our healing, and yes, our tears. I'm your host, Dr. Tammy Isaac, and today we're stepping into a tender space, one that often goes unnamed yet quietly moves through us like a ripple effect, touching more of us than we realize. Today we're going to be talking about secondary grief. It's the ache you carry that doesn't quite belong to you, but still lives in your body like it does. Maybe it's the pain you feel watching someone you love grieve the loss of their loved one, or the quiet sorrow that sneaks in as you support others, always holding space and always being strong. Or maybe it's the weight you didn't even realize you've been carrying because you've been so busy holding someone else together. Secondary grief is real. It's also sacred, and it deserves room to breathe. So today in this episode, we're going to name it, unpack it, and we're going to give it space. I'll walk with you through what secondary grief looks like, how it shows up in our lives, and we can honor it without becoming so buried underneath it. Okay, so let's take a moment and breathe. And let's dive in. What exactly is secondary grief? Well, secondary grief it's a term that doesn't always show up in your everyday grief conversations, but its presence is very real. Secondary grief is the emotional response we feel when someone close to us experiences a loss, or when we're affected by the ripple effect of another person's pain. It's not your loss per se, but it imparts you deeply. It affects you deeply. It might be your best friend's miscarriage, your coworker losing a parent, or the lingering heaviness you carry as a caregiver. Even as a chaplain like me, a nurse, a pastor, constantly showing up for others while quietly absorbing this sorrow. Secondary grief kind of whispers. It doesn't scream the way primary grief might, but it still speaks. It shows up in your body as fatigue, in your mind as emotional or brain fog, in your spirit as heaviness. You cannot always name. Sometimes it looks like crying after you've been strong all day for someone else. Sometimes it feels like a short temper or some unexpected anxiety or needing to be silent, even when nothing big has happened to you personally. But here's the truth. Just because the loss wasn't yours directly doesn't mean the grief isn't real. These same effects that you experience with secondary grief are the same effects that you would experience if this was your own grief. So there's no difference in what you can experience. The difference is where this grief came from. God wired us to feel deeply, to empathize, to bear one another's burdens, right? But He never called us to carry what we haven't processed. Secondary grief invites us to pause and ask, whose pain am I carrying? And have I allowed myself the space to feel it, to name it, and to release it? I want to name this kind of grief today because so many of us are experiencing it without even realizing it. And we're exhausted and we don't even know why. Like, we're overwhelmed and we just think it's burnout. But what if it's grief? Ask yourself that. Grief you didn't know that you had. Grief you didn't know the name of. Grief you never expected, right? This type of grief is often layered. So it builds slowly over time, especially for those of us who support others for a living or love people deeply. In my field, so I work in the hospital as a chaplain. And so I see a variety of people in the different stages of their health and in their health journey. Prior to this, I was a chaplain in hospice for 6 years. And so every patient that I met and experienced was dying. And so if you do not properly care for yourself, it was easy to fall over into secondary grief. And even if you did experience secondary grief, because I did before, it's okay. I just need to acknowledge it. I need to name it so that I can process it and heal and not find myself just there. The thing is, secondary grief, because it doesn't always come with the rituals of primary grief, like funerals, flowers, or condolences, it can often really go acknowledge, but not today. That's not what we want to do. We want to be able to name it. We want to be able to address it. We want to give it space. We want it to breathe today. And so that we can start moving into the healing. Because like I was saying just a moment ago, if you don't process that and you keep carrying it as if it's your own, you'll never be able to identify and get to the root of it so that you can move into the healing. I mentioned that I worked in hospice and I had a nurse, and nurses very often will experience secondary grief, who couldn't function after a death of a patient because she was so consumed with the grief from that patient's passing and the family, but did not want to sit down and process through it. But you have to return to work, right? Because hospice, everybody's dying. So that meant the next patient she was going to was also going to be dying, but it would also be feeding the grief that she was already experiencing. And even if you work in a space where maybe everybody's not dying, but the consistency of having to, like for me, hear people's stories and their burdens can also bring about secondary grief. And maybe later in the episode, I'll share some moments where I have experienced that secondary grief. But again, it's important for us to name it, to give it space, to let it breathe so that we can process and be able to start our healing. So, how do you know if you're experiencing secondary grief? Sometimes your secondary grief is not loud and obvious, right? It doesn't always come with tears or a breaking point. It can be quiet and subtle, but very much real. And your body will always know, even when your mind hasn't caught up, when your mind hasn't processed to understand what's happening, your body will know that there's been a shift and there's a change and that there's something happening. Um, you might be emotionally tired, not just physically tired, but your soul could be weary. Maybe you've been showing up for everybody else, and when it's time to like really care for yourself, like you have nothing left to give to yourself. I was just talking to a young lady on yesterday who is caring for her family, her children. And then at the end of the day, she doesn't have anything to pour back into herself. And so she's weary and she's feeling tired and she's feeling very overwhelmed because she's not in a happy place, because she's always down in the slumps after an exhausting day of caring for her family. And then there's like nothing left. So I use the example of cooking dinner, right? And then you're feeding everybody and making sure that they have enough and even more if they like. And then when you go back to the pot, you done gave it all out and there's nothing for you to sit down and eat dinner. That's what it's like sometimes caring for other people, that we dish out so much that we forget to fill our own selves back in. And so I suggest many times to caregivers to make sure sometimes you got to feed yourself first. And I use the analogy, and many of you have heard, if you've ever been on an airline flight, they tell you if in the case of something happening on this plane and these airbags come down, they tell you put your mask on first before you help somebody else, right? Because you'll be over here helping somebody put their mask on and there you go passed out and you've been no help to nobody else. So it's important sometimes, I share with this mother of four, hey, you may have to sacrifice and get up an hour earlier so that you can eat and have time to yourself in the morning so that you're more refreshed than waiting to the end of the day to do things for yourself when you're more exhausted. Okay. But it's important that we don't get to the point where we have nothing left to put back into ourselves. This can cause secondary grief to happen and show up in your life. You may find yourself also feeling guilty for being so affected. And this is another place where moms feel guilty about feeling overwhelmed or sad because they don't have time for themselves and they've been just dishing everything out. You might say things like, but it wasn't even my loss, or, I didn't even know them well, as if our tears need permission to fall because this was a different loss from what you expected. Let me go ahead and say this clearly. Your grief is valid. It is always valid. It doesn't matter what kind of grief it is, whether it is your primary grief or your secondary grief. Even when it's connected to someone else's pain, your grief is still valid. Okay. Another sign is irritability or emotional numbness, especially if you're someone who normally feels deeply empathetic, right? Sometimes the heart goes into this protection mode, and when it's carrying too much for too long, it just kind of shuts off the emotions and feelings. And you may also feel hyper responsible, like it's your job to keep everyone else okay, but deep down, you're not okay yourself. And that's the heavy burden of secondary grief. We're holding others, but not handling our own sorrow. And a lot of times we do this because it's so much easier to help other people with their feelings than for us to sit down to face our emotions, to face our sorrow, to face our pain, to name it, to give it space to grieve. We feel like it's so much easier to turn our face from it and focus on other people. Now, some folks will experience compassion fatigue. So it's a slow depletion of joy and purpose in roles that once felt meaningful. So especially for those of us that are in caregiving and chaplaincy or ministry, this grief is cumulative. So it builds over time and you slowly start to experience compassion fatigue. And if you're not careful to notice, this is why it's important as a chaplain and being a chaplain in clinical pastoral education and being board certified, is that they teach us how important it is to have reflection and to process those events or encounters that were very emotional. Because when we don't sit down and give space to it, to acknowledge it, to name it, and to allow it to breathe, then what happens is we fall into this compassion fatigue, which, sometimes can also be called secondary grief. Slowly our joy for what we love is depleted. And you're asking yourself, wait a minute, I love doing this. Why am I not finding joy from it? Okay. So you have to be careful and be aware, especially in the line of work that you're doing, not even just work, but as a caregiver of somebody who's taking care of a loved one who is sick and you're at home. And on top of that are also working a full-time job. So you want to be very careful, okay? And maybe the most telling sign in this is you feel everything and nothing all at once, right? So the question is, what do we do with that? Wait a minute. We acknowledge it. We name it without shame. We let our humanity be seen, not just by others, but also by God. And we give ourselves what we so freely offer to everyone else. And that is, say it with me, grace or permission, right? Because, guys, you can't pour from a soul that is silently grieving. What can you pour but sorrow and pain into other people in your caregiving? Today's episode of Permission to Breathe is sponsored by Aurora's Grief Journey, my new children's book about navigating loss and finding comfort. Aurora's Grief Journey follows a young girl who's learning to cope with the loss of her grandfather. Through heartfelt storytelling and faith-filled activities, the book helps children understand their feelings and provides families with practical ways to heal together. If you're looking for a gentle resource to support a child through grief, this book is the perfect place to start. You can grab your copy today on Amazon. Thank you for tuning in. Now let's continue this journey of healing together. Let's talk about how secondary grief can build up layer by layer. Because this isn't always a one-time experience, for many of us, it's cumulative. It happens over time, especially if you are the strong one, the helper, the encourager, the one others lean on. And every time you sit with someone in their sorrow, every time you hold space for a loved one who's hurting, every time you stay up late to listen, to pray, to comfort, you're giving a piece of yourself away. And that, of course, is a holy, sacred work. But if we're not careful, that sacred giving can become silent depletion. Okay, and I have seen this happen in people's lives, and they don't realize that every single day and every single event is stealing their joy away, and they become weary, fatigued, tired, aches and pains in the body that they can't figure out. They become rude and normally not rude and angry and quick-tempered, right? Secondary grief it's like a sponge that soaks up the sorrow around it. At first, it's manageable, but with every new loss, whether yours or someone else's, it gets heavier. And if we're never figuring it out, processing out, we start to live saturated with pain we didn't even realize that we have been carrying. And so when you look up this pain, this sorrow that has saturated your life causes your perception on life and all the beliefs and morals and thoughts that you had of good intentions have now changed, and you see from a different perspective and a different frame of negativity. And you may feel confused about why you're so affected by someone else's loss. You might even feel silly or ashamed of your emotions, but beloved, listen, this is not about being too sensitive. This is about being deeply connected, right? It has nothing to do about being too sensitive, but it is about the depth of your connection with these people, right? Of course, we were created to love and to feel, and sometimes our souls break open simply because we care, okay? And I found that in caregiving roles, especially spiritual ones, secondary grief can even echo your own path. Let me not just say spiritual, but just this constant caregiving where you have a passion for really caring for people. Like I've seen people who are kind of like unspokenly the caregiver for the family. Anybody sick, this person is always the one to take care of them. And so you're constantly in that role. And it can echo like your own past wounds, your own experiences, things that you've gone through in your life. Like someone else's loss may stir up grief that you haven't touched in years. The death of a patient may remind you of your mother, of friends. Heartbreak might resurface. I mean, your own. That's what makes secondary grief so layered. It's not just their pain, but it's also what has awakened in us, right? I want to give you this example, and this just happened yesterday where me and some of the staff were talking about a patient's experience, which led us into talking about our own childhood and our own life experiences. And the conversation quickly went so deep and emotional that when we were done talking, I was like, whew, like I wasn't expecting to think about all this. And there were things in my head that I started to recall and think about as I walked away from there, personal things that I didn't share with them that now is on my mind and was weighing on me heavy after having the conversation with them about somebody else's experience. Okay. So it's important to know that this is spiritual, it's emotional, it's physical, and when left unacknowledged, it can quietly harden us or quietly break us. And I have seen this happen in people and they don't even know that that's what's happening. But I do also want to say that there is hope. And the hope is when we recognize those layers, we can begin to peel them back gently, one by one, with compassion and not criticism. And we can invite God into each one of those layers as we pull them back, because God doesn't just heal the grief that shouts. He also tends to the grief that whispers, the grief that trickles down into the hidden corners of our hearts. So the question is, what do we do with all of this? What do we do with the grief that isn't exactly ours, but lives within us as if it does? You know what we do? We give ourselves permission to breathe. We pause. We acknowledge the weight that we've been carrying. And we stop apologizing for needing rest and space and healing, even when we're the strong ones. And let me just say this, pause and say this, that because we are the strong ones, I have learned, because I am one of the strong ones, I have learned that People have an expectation of me to continue to be strong, even when I'm in my weak moments or in the moments where I need help, I need space, I need to breathe, I need healing. And so if you're the strong one, you have to get to the place where you tell people, right? I need rest. I need space. And then there's the other strong one who have to get to the point where you receive when somebody expresses you need rest, you need space, you need healing. Okay? Healing from secondary grief doesn't look like doing more. Okay. That's important too for the strong ones, right? It looks like being honest, right? Honest to say, I need help, and honest to receive that you need help. It looks like asking yourself, whose grief am I carrying? Where am I feeling this in my body? And what do I need to release today? Sometimes it means letting yourself cry over someone else's pain without guilt. And sometimes it means stepping away from for a moment just to breathe, to pray, or to sit in silence without explaining why. I often am sitting in silence when I leave work. There are a lot of times that I don't pull right off the parking lot because I'm just sitting in my car. I'm allowing the day to kind of flush over me so that I'm not taking anything with me. There are times throughout the day that I do come to my office and close the door so that I can sit and reflect, right? Times where I just need silence because of all of the things that I'm carrying that don't belong to me. Okay. So it's okay to be able to step away, to breathe, to pray, to sit in silence without having to explain to anybody. There are boundaries that I've learned to set in place for me that I don't have a need to explain to anybody why I'm doing or not doing what I am doing or not doing. I don't feel the need to explain that. I just do it or not do it. And if there's a question asked, I am absolutely available to acknowledge both to them and myself, I need this space for me to be healthy. Okay. One of the most sacred practices that you can adopt is simply being present with yourself and with God. So one of the things that I often have shared many times is something like a breath prayer where you take a deep breath in, you hold it gently, and then you exhale slowly. And you can share scriptures in between as you do your breathing in and out, right? So you're doing an inhale, a hold, and an exhale. And then you can pause for a few beats, and then you can allow an affirmation or a scripture to be released. You can say things like, God, help me release what is not mine to carry. You can say, help me honor it without holding it. Things like that. That's going to help, process you through what you're experiencing in those quiet moments. There are times that I'm driving, and for most people who know, I commute to work. So I usually have about an hour, 15, hour and a half drive, eat both ways. And so people who know me know I listen to a lot of like podcasts and audible books, but there are times where I am just in silence because I need to release and process all that I have experienced that day. And sometimes it's not other people's experiences, but it is mine that I'm dealing with. Remember, having encounters with people and experiencing people can awaken your own wounds and things that you have, which brings the grief into you, right? Based on somebody else's experience. And so sometimes there are things that I need to just process and be quiet as I'm driving, which is very helpful. Sometimes I'm listening to classical music, which helps kind of settle my spirit and my anxiety. So there are so many things that you really can do, but I do like the breath prayer very much. I often recommend doing that. And then, of course, there are things that you can do that we most often mention. If you like journaling, you can journal. You can create different rituals, like, we talk about lighting candles, taking a walk, things like that that will honor the moment of what you are experiencing, or maybe honor the primary person's grief by doing something that primary person would experience or would love to do. You can also just talk to somebody, maybe a friend or a therapist or somebody who can hold space for you. Absolutely be honest and pray. Or if you meditate, but you want to be able to release, honestly, your raw truth of how you are feeling and how you are experiencing what's happening. And then the other thing is just to rest. Sometimes we just need to rest spiritually, to lay ourselves down and to really trust God in holding what we cannot really carry or hold on our own. Okay. So grief, whether direct or secondary, again, it's not a sign of weakness. It's evidence that you love deeply and that your soul responds to the pain of the world around you, right? And that doesn't need to be fixed, but it does need to be felt. As we bring this episode to a close today, I want you to sit with this truth. Grief doesn't have to belong to you directly to live within you. Sometimes love is what opens the door, and empathy is what invites the grief in. You are not broken for feeling deeply about others' pain. You're not weak for being affected by others' pain. You are simply human, and that humanity is sacred. We live in a world where we're often expected to move on quickly, to be the strong one, to hold everyone else together, but carrying the weight of someone else's sorrow day after day without tending to your own heart, that's not strength. That's strain. And it will, listen to me, it will catch up with you in the quiet moments, in your body, in your spirit. Secondary grief may not demand your attention with loud cries, but it will whisper through fatigue, frustration, and emotional numbness until you listen. So today, I am inviting you to slow down long enough to ask, what have I absorbed? What have I been holding that no one ever saw me carry? And what do I need in order to feel seen, heard, and whole again? You don't need to explain your grief. You don't need to justify your tenderness. You just need to acknowledge it and honor it. Grief of any kind is the cost of our connection. And healing comes when we stop pretending we're unaffected. So, give yourself the same compassion you so freely give others. Give yourself room to feel. Give yourself rest. And give yourself permission to grieve and to breathe. Until next time. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. I hope today created space for you to breathe and find peace on your journey. I invite you to join me again next Monday for another episode as we continue to navigate this path together. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and to share the podcast. Until next time, take care and keep breathing unapologetically.